But I want to go back to the origins of the conflict and the differences in the points of view of the various people about the origins of the conflict. So Jeffrey Sachs, now going on 2 years ago, placed the blame in part, like Putin does, and some others do, on the U.S. He wrote, quote, regarding the Ukraine war, the Biden administration has repeatedly and falsely claimed that the Ukraine war started with an unprovoked attack by Russia on Ukraine on February 24, 2022. In fact, the war was provoked by the U.S. in ways that leading U.S. diplomats anticipated for decades in the lead up to the war, end quote. Our friend and frequent Stay Tuned podcast guest Ian Bremmer and Jeffrey Sachs got into a bit of a debate about that. As a trained lawyer, I'd like to know what terms mean. A, do you agree with Jeffrey Sachs or not? And what the hell do we mean by unprovoked and provoked?
I'll start, go very quick. I expect we might agree more than disagree. I think that position is preposterous. Let me just say that.
All right. Ian will be pleased to hear you say that.
And just to be clear, that Jeffrey Sachs's position is preposterous, not Ian Bremmer's position. If this was provoked by talk of NATO enlargement, it would have happened a long time ago when NATO surfaced the idea. It did not. And NATO was never making good on that idea, either in 2014, when Russia first went into Ukraine to take Crimea and parts of the East, much less in 2022. It wasn't as though anything was imminent to enlarge NATO, put Western troops in there and all that. So the idea that there's a causality between a statement back when at the Bucharest NATO summit and what Russia has done in recent years just doesn't pass the serious test. Plus, if you read Mr. Putin's, I'm not sure what one calls it, his op-ed of sorts. Diatribe, fair enough, of the summer just before the February 2022 intervention. He wasn't focusing on NATO. He was focusing on what his views of or dreams of Russian history and Ukraine's importance to Russia and the like. So no, this is almost the law of parsimony. Sometimes the simplest analysis is right. This was a case of unprovoked aggression. And in Putin's defense, my guess is he thought this would be pretty easy to get away with. He watched Afghanistan. He saw what happened there. He had a pretty dismal view of the willingness of the United States and Europe and Ukraine to stand up to him. So my guess, and he probably had an exaggerated view of his own military. So you add all that up, my sense is he saw a massive opportunity and he went to take it. And so again, I don't think it's that hard to offer up an assessment of what has happened and why. But the idea that somehow this was provoked, again, that's the kind of apology I expect to come out of the Kremlin, not out of Western academics.
Julia?
I'm going to yes and Richard, and I'm going to do it much less eloquently. I'm going to say that's total fucking bullshit. I mean...
Can you also say that in Russian?
Ой, пиздит.
It sounds so much better in Russian. Can I just say that? It has an element of disdain.
Oh, I don't know that my mother would agree. Ой, пиздит is what I want to say to Jeffrey Sachs, who, by the way, made a killing in Russia in the 90s. But let's just rewind, right? I agree with Richard. If this was in fact the root cause and not, Grandpa went a little crazy in isolation reading weird history blogs on the internet, then yeah, it would have happened a lot earlier. But if you looked at what happened earlier, in fact, as late as 2014, Russia was doing joint exercises with NATO. Why would Russia have been doing that if it was so provocative? Why did Russia during the Obama administration, if NATO was such a threat on its borders, and NATO enlargement up to its borders was such a threat, why did Russia allow a NATO transit point inside Russian territory at Ulyanovsk to help NATO get men and material or troops and material to Afghanistan if NATO was such a threat? Maybe because it wasn't. Maybe because this is all bullshit. If NATO or the US was so provocative? Why did it attack Ukraine? Why not attack NATO? Why not attack the US? Because, in fact, it's not about NATO and the US. It is about Ukraine. And it is about Ukraine drifting toward the West. It is exactly as Richard said. It's because Ukraine, in Putin's mistaken view, is basically Russia with a made-up identity and a made-up language. Putin has always had a very kind of mistaken view, fed by kind of sycophantic intelligence, that Ukrainians are basically Russian and they want to be part of Russia and that they'd be greeted as liberators. And the idea that if they became democratic, that they did, in fact, when the Maidan happened in 2014, they did give a lot of hope to Russian liberals who said, hey, if the Ukrainians can do it, why can't we? Why can't we build a Western-style democracy? And so the one other thing I'll say is that America is responsible for this insofar as I would say two things. The first is what George W. Bush did at Bucharest in 2008 was, in fact, provocative because it opened the door further for Ukraine to join the West. And so it did kind of anger Putin, but it didn't offer any protection to the Ukrainians. So it was the worst of both worlds. It angered Putin, but then left Ukraine twisting in the wind, closed the door right in front of their face as the bullies kind of chasing them down the street. And then I think the Biden administration made a mistake in kind of microdosing military aid and having to do this, making the Ukrainians do this whole song and dance for months and months each time for each new military capability. And there was an article in the Wall Street Journal, I think, that very accurately diagnosed the problem by saying that it was basically like introducing different types of antibiotics very slowly and giving the bacteria time to evolve resistance each time. So I think those are the mistakes that the U.S. made. But I don't. Again, if NATO was so provocative, why did Putin allow a NATO base on Russian territory?
Yeah, I mean, the problem I have, not being a foreign policy expert, not having the background that you two have, is, lots of things can be a provocation. Putin could say, unless you increase spending on soccer, I'm going to be provoked. But is a provocation reasonable or is it not? We don't have time to get into that, but at some point in the future, I'd love to talk about that. Folks, never miss an episode of Stay Tuned. Hit that subscribe button now. If you'd like to support our work, consider becoming an insider. You'll get exclusive access to my weekly podcast with Joyce Vance, where we break down the biggest legal and political stories, and you get other membership benefits as well. Head to cafe.com/insider to learn more and to join. That's cafe.com/insider.